Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, distinguished speakers on the dais, and delegates to this conference. I must congratulate you for choosing this topic. Literature and democracy. And the concept note which was circulated, which identified the important issues before this conference. Because I think we have reached a stage where we need to discuss this interaction between freedom for literature and the scope of democracy. I certainly know what it means to be without democracy, and when the state of emergency was declared, and many people had to go to jail. I did not go to jail because they were not able to catch me. But no, I escaped twice, once via Colombo and once via Nepal. The issue is that there is no doubt that this country values democracy intrinsically. When the elections were declared in 1977, I was still that time in the United States campaigning, making preparations to return to contest the elections. When almost all the intellectuals in the United States said that this is a futile election for you, because democracy is meant for educated people and people who are not hungry. With this vast amount of poverty, it's unlikely that the people are going to vote on issues whether there is freedom or no freedom, fundamental rights or no fundamental rights. The prediction was almost unanimous that Mrs. Indira Gandhi would return with an increased majority to power in that election of 1977. When the results came out, of course, Mrs. Gandhi and her party were defeated. But the surprising part was that the most uneducated part of India voted for democracy, and the relatively more educated part of India, namely South India, voted for Mrs. Gandhi. And there is no explanation except one explanation has been, which is, I thought, very superficial, not true, that the impact of the emergency was not felt in the South. That's not true. We know many of our volunteers who suffered enormously torture, police torture, incarceration, and so on. But there is no doubt that education has got nothing to do with the love for democracy. And the UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh poor people chose to vote for democracy because they felt that at least in a democracy they had some place to go to explain their grievances. I think that factor is responsible why we are still a vibrant democracy. And therefore, to preserve this democracy, we have to take all necessary steps, including how literature develops in this country. Unfortunately, till the period of Jawaharlal Nehru and his influence, particularly through the Congress Party and his daughter, there was a distinct, marked left-wing inspiration in our literature. And that left-wing influence in our literature manifested itself in denying the entry of anyone who would speak in nationalistic terms or would speak about the glorious ancient traditions of India. And consequently, most of the academies, the cultural organizations floated by government were dominated by people who belonged to the left-wing spectrum of our society. And that had a decisive break in 2014, the year when you started your literary conference. And that year, a party which didn't come out of the Nehruvian traditions or a breakaway group of Congress came with absolute majority into power. And it today faces a constant onslaught from those who are no more in power, but had been in power for many, many decades. We have the agitation on returning the awards. I don't know how many ultimately returned it and how many didn't quietly take it back. But the fact of the matter is that there was no occasion for doing so, because the institutions of democracy were still functioning. Elections were taking place, and the ruling party in the center lost a few elections. But in the process, we have discovered something new, and that is the articulation of cultural unity of India. It does produce a great deal of political dividend. This was demonstrated in the 2014 Lok Sabha elections and has been now recently demonstrated in Assam. So there is therefore two schools now competing for literature. One is the old left-wing school, and the other is a new, more invigorated, what I would call as the cultural nationalist group, which talks about India as a continuing civilization, which talks about an intrinsic unity of India, and places less emphasis on the divisions in our country. Because really, if one were to look at the modern scientific fact, this is something not reflected in the literature of the past. And that is that we are one people. And this is demonstrated now scientifically in the journals of genetics, which have tabulated the DNA on a sample basis, not only in India, but in the University Cambridge Journal of Genetics, the University of Houston, of course the University of Mysore, which has done pioneering work. And it says that the DNA is the same for Indians all over India. There may be a small deviation here. You might find in some of the extreme border situations where there would be some mingling. Or you will occasionally find an Italian marrying an Indian, and therefore a small portion of that. So, but the broad DNA structure of Indians is the same. And the divisions that we were told are intrinsic to Hinduism, for example, now turn out to be not at all intrinsic. The caste system, for example, or the Varna system, now it turns out to be something that was never birth-based. And in fact, when you start looking at examples, you find that people who are born in different Varnas acquired through their commitment or through their adoption different Varnas. For instance, Vishwamitra was born of Kshatriya parents, but he became the greatest of our Maharishis. Vedavyasa's mother was a fisherwoman. Kalidasa was actually a Vanavasi, cutting branches of trees. And today the Dalits own Valmiki as their own. And Valmiki indeed came from a Dalit family. And we have found that where the Dalit is educated to the maximum possible. He is, in fact, as good as anybody else. The case of Ambedkar, who was sent by his teacher. Incidentally, his teacher's name was Ambedkar. Ambedkar's original name is not Ambedkar. His teacher was a Brahmin teacher. And he gave his name to him and said, otherwise there will be prejudice against you. And enabled him to go to Columbia, where he got a PhD in economics. And then a law degree in England. And came back to pilot and be the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. So indeed, I have found this even in my own ad hoc investigation, this to be true. Once I heard Raj Thackeray talking about UP taxiwalas taking away all the Marathi jobs. So I managed to get a sample of his hair from his hairdresser. And I also got a sample of the hair from the UP taxi driver in Bombay. And sent it to the microbiological laboratory in Hyderabad. And back came the report that the DNA is the same of both. Unless Raj Thackeray originally came from UP and he had hidden that fact. So today, when you are having literature development, the first thing is you must recognize that India is like a half glass full or a half glass empty, depending on your perspectives. And that literature should reflect the strengths of the society as much as its weakness. Are there boundaries to literature? Well, that's where democracy comes. Today, democracy is not an absolute right of everybody. There are what Jawaharlal Nehru did, in fact, bring a first amendment to the Constitution which said that fundamental rights are subject to reasonable restriction. One of them is that you don't have a right to advocate the disintegration of the country. That's one of the reasonable restrictions that is imposed in Article 20 of bracket 3 of the Constitution. And similarly, to create public disorder, bring an elected government into contempt for overthrowing it. So, in effect, the Constitution places certain reasonable restrictions within which you can advocate or write or propagate. You can't say that you want the disintegration of India, as we recently saw in Jawaharlal Nehru University, as an expression of free thought. It's not permitted in the Constitution. So if you are going to say that literature must thrive in a democracy and literature can only thrive in a free society which has democracy, in my opinion, then literature also has to accept certain reasonable restrictions. And that reasonable restrictions includes not propagating a society which was never one. In fact, there was a period when we used to advocate that had the British not come, there would have been no India at all. And that India was actually created as an administrative structure by the British, because now very few people say that. But I think today we must celebrate the fact that this country's unity has sustained and remained despite all the pulls and pressures. The Soviet Union today is broken up into 16 countries. Yugoslavia broke up into 4. Indonesia is broken up into 2. Pakistan broken up right before your eyes into 2. But India has remained unbroken after 1947, despite all the dire predictions that India would break up. And I think that literature, which actually emphasizes in a depressing way the exploitation, the misery, that certain people suffer ought to be there, so nobody should ban that. But at the same time, literature which celebrates the unity of India should be recognized by the community of literary scholars as something that deserves to be recognized and praised and in fact given prizes for. So it is this thing where today we are grappling. All this intolerance debate that's taken place is people who had a free run of running down the system because they were persuaded by the left-wing ideology. Today are turned against the present dispensation in power on the grounds of ideology. But in the process, there is no room for accommodation. Unless there is a consensus, how can literature survive? And consensus means listening to both sides, so both views. We know that today, those who had a free run for almost 60, 70 years, 65 years, today are not willing to tolerate even a proposition which calls for revision of history. Much of what you have been told is not sustained by modern science. There is no such thing as an Aryan invasion. There is no evidence for that. There is no such thing as a racial difference between Aryans and Dravidians. They were never meant as original terms. There is no word Aryan in any of our scriptures. Arya is there, which means only a cultured person, a good person. And Dravidian was a word which was invented by the Shankaracharya to designate where three coasts meet, and that is South India. Dravida was a concept for South India. But it was the British who gave it this racial meaning. And now it is part of our literature, particularly that comes out of Tamil Nadu, which propagates that Tamils are different people because they are Dravida. Even their concept that many of their books write about Ravan being a great Dravida king. Unfortunately, Ravan is not from the Dravida. Ravan was born near Delhi in a place called Noida. There's a village, you can go and see it even today, called Basra. And he went to Mansarovar, and Lord Shiva gave him a boon. On that basis, he looked around which country he could conquer. His brother or his cousin brother, Kuber, had made Lanka into a beautiful country. So he conquered Lanka and became its king. But for years, there was a celebration of Raman Leela in Tamil Nadu and debunking Ramayana as something foreign for India. And it was part of our literature. And so all these require revision today. Our languages may look different, but in essential terms it is the same. Our constitution now requires that the link language, which Hindi is supposed to be, must borrow its vocabulary, according to Article 341, from Sanskrit. But today we heard Mr. Karunanidhi speak against Sanskrit. But his own name is Sanskrit, Karunanidhi. He has not found a Tamil equivalent of it today. So therefore, I would say that this debate should discuss this question, whether there are Lakshman Rekhas for literature, whether as for a democracy, in the Constitution, there is reasonable restrictions placed on your freedom of expression, reasonable restrictions placed on your expression and your speech, and almost all fundamental rights are subject to reasonable restriction, including the freedom to worship. Article 25 of the Constitution makes it very clear that free pursuit of your religious expression is subject to 3 conditions. It should not violate public order, it should not be against morality, and it should not be adverse to your health. That's there in the Constitution. So if democracy means acceptance of reasonable restrictions, does literature also have to devise? This has to be done by people who are in the field of literature. It can't be imposed, except to the extent that the Constitution imposes it on you. But as part of the community of those who are in the field of literature, they should themselves discuss whether that for this country, for its democracy to survive and prosper, whether literature itself should have a consensus worked out beyond which you will not allow literature to go, or at least be a part of the mainstream of your literature. There can be always extremists who can write anything they like and get caught perhaps, and the law take its course with them. But as a community, I think time has come, especially after 2014, for us to, in the field of literature, to think of what should not constitute literature. I certainly don't think that any literature which idealizes division to the point of breaking, which may identify these divisions but to celebrate them, or to advocate those things which would put society into disintegration and degeneration, whether that should be permitted as part of literature. And indeed, if the government were to act on it, there are debates going on every day whether a certain film should be shown or not, or whether a certain book should be banned or not. Of course, we been quite active in banning books over the last 30-40 years. Salman Rushdie's book was not banned by the BJP government, it was banned by the Communist government. And his inability to participate in a literary fest in Jaipur was not during the time of BJP. So the question therefore becomes, who's to decide these boundaries? And I think the most important thing is, as far as democracy is concerned, the Lakshman Rekha is written in the Constitution. But as far as literature is concerned, it has to be evolved and by the community which you represent. And that is extremely essential for nurturing both democracy and the unity of India. Thank you very much.